This video is all about pests and diseases. I'm going to give you my philosophy on how I handle problems in the garden, and I think that if you follow that, it's going to solve a lot of problems for you. I'll then have a look at some common pests and diseases and provide you with solutions about what you can do about them. A lot of places are starting to implement pesticide bans, and that's really a good thing for the environment, at least in most cases. What this means is that you can't just reach for a bottle of chemical when you have a problem. It also means that we have to start doing things differently in the garden. And that's where my general philosophy comes in. I have a large garden, 6 acres. I grow 3,000 different types of plants. I don't use pesticides on anything, whether they're commercial, synthetic, or home cures. I don't use any of those things. And part of it is my philosophy. The first important concept you have to understand is that most bugs are good bugs. Now, I usually use the number that 8 out of 10 are good bugs. I don't know how accurate that is. Someone criticized me once and said, oh, it's more like 7 out of 10. Other people think it's 9 out of 10. The important point here is that most of the things you see in the garden, these insects, are good insects. They're predators. They're taking care of your plants. They're doing good things in the garden. What that means is that every time we do something in the garden to hurt bugs, we're harming the good guys as well as the bad guys. So I see a lot of requests that go something like this. I have a problem on my tomato plants. What can I spray to kill that bug? But I don't want to harm the bees. Well, I have news for you. When you spray stuff, you harm all the insects. Now, maybe not bees, because bees might not be going down and landing on the leaves on your tomato plants, but spraying that stuff around hurts all the other bugs. And unfortunately, gardeners only know a few good bugs. Bees, butterflies, those are good bugs. We go out of our way to take care of these guys. You see a wasp and we want to smash that wasp. Well, it turns out that most wasps are good guys. They go after insects. They take care of the bugs in your garden. And 98% of the wasps don't sting. They're all good guys, but they're all grouped into one category. Wasps are bad, bees are good. These kind of concepts are really kind of silly, and we have to see past those. Most problems are cultural. I see a lot of questions where they post a picture and they say, what's eating my plant? What can I spray? And you look at it and say, well, you haven't seen an insect, you don't know it's an insect, and it's probably cultural. So most of the time when plants have problems, it's cultural, which means water, fertilizer, sun, shade, something you're doing with the plant. Always look there first. The last one is kind of a philosophical things. Good bugs and bad bugs, they all have to live, they all have to eat. And if we're going to have a good ecosystem, we're going to have a good environment in our gardens, we have to have bad bugs. The good bugs eat the bad ones. If we get rid of all the bad bugs, we won't have any good bugs either. And this is one of the problems in gardens is people work too hard at getting rid of all their pests. So they don't attract the predators, which means that when they do have a pest outbreak, it's usually severe because the predators aren't there. They're in someone else's garden. They're in my garden because I don't spray anything. I let everything kind of live. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't a few pests we have to control, but for the most part, you have to allow some damage in your garden. One way to get rid of pests is to grow different plants. If you're shopping around for plants and you buy one, you bring it home and it gets pests all the time, don't grow that plant. You can only grow, 100, 200 different kinds of plants in most gardens, and yet there's thousands to choose from. Why are you growing a plant that has constant problems? I'll give you an example. I love monardas. They make these red and pink flowers. They're quite nice plants. Now, they spread a bit too much for me, but they're beautiful plants. The problem is they almost all get mildew. So I can't stand that. I'm not going to treat them for mildew. So I kick them out of the garden and I'm growing something that doesn't get mildew. That's a great way to get rid of these pests. Variety equals diversity, which equals healthier plants. Over and over again, science has shown us that when we group a lot of different things together, all the plants in that group benefit. When we have monocultures, we have problems. And that's why we have a lot of issues with farming. Now, they have to be monocultures to produce the food, so we can't blame them for that. But that is an unhealthy environment. We do it because we need to eat. Our gardens are a little different. In our gardens, we can mix things up, have lots of different things. The more types of plants you have, the less pests you will have. Because an insect isn't going to fly all the way down the street because you have one Monarda plant sitting there. It's going to come when you've got 20 Monarda. Make homes for living things. So find out the things that eat the pests. So slugs, for instance, is a big problem for some people. Well, if you have a slug problem, then make homes for the toads, the frog, those snakes that many of you hate. They eat slugs, so we want those. Beetles. There's a whole bunch of ground beetles that eat slugs, particularly the small ones and slug eggs. So we want those critters in there, and we want to encourage an environment where they grow. The last one is kind of a personal philosophy thing that I've learned over the years. I doubt I was like this when I first gardened. I'm sure I was just like all the other new gardeners, and every little hole in a plant was critical. But over the years, I've learned to just live with it. So you might come to my garden and say, geez, this guy's got a lot of pests. I mean, look, all these leaves have some holes, some chew marks. So what? Live with it. I only get upset when you have a really serious problem. I love this little guy. He's a tree frog, and during the day they sleep. And so he found this secretive little place for him to hide inside this daylily flower, and he'll sleep there all day. Tree frogs are actually hard to find if you go to look for them, but if you're in an area where they exist, you seem to find them all the time. I've already seen at least a dozen of them this year, and it's always a surprise wherever they're hanging out. So he's hiding. But I put this slide in to remind me that we have to encourage those things in the garden that eat the bad bugs. And this guy loves bugs, so I encourage him. He can stay wherever he wants. So I'm going to look at some common problems that you might find in the garden. The specific cases I'm going to look at are of value because I've picked things that you're more likely to see in the garden, but they're also important as a general way of how to deal with these various things. Here's a plant I really love the flower of. It's a bearded iris. And by the way, if you've never seen a large garden of bearded irises, the Royal Botanical Garden in Hamilton has a fabulous collection. When they're blooming, there are hundreds of different color combination of these guys. And it really is worth a trip down to the gardens just to see the bearded iris. Lovely, lovely plants in flower, ugly plants when they're out of flower, but the flowers are some of the best in the garden. The problem is bearded iris, you have a problem, and it's the iris borer. And here's a little slide that shows you some of the signs that you have this problem. You see these ratted edges, this frass. Frass, by the way, is just a fancy name for insect poop. This insect burrows inside the leaf. So it's living inside. You don't see it. It's a little caterpillar. And of course, if it's eating the leaves, it's also pooping, and it leaves behind these little black spots. So if you see these things on your iris, you may have the iris borer. And if we have a closer look, this is what it looks like. And if you have it and you open up one of these leaves, you'll be living inside that iris leaf. It burrows down these leaves until it gets to the tuber at the bottom. So one of the ways to combat this is to make sure it never gets there. And people will either squeeze those leaves to kill it or cut off the leaves early before it can burrow all the way down to the tuber. Once it gets into the tuber, it starts eating the tuber. And that doesn't actually do that much damage. The problem is, in its eating motion, I guess it has some tasty saliva. So bacteria show up and they like this liquid. And so the iris gets a bacterial infection, and that's usually what kills the iris. So what do you do about this? It turns out that the iris borer only attacks certain types of bearded irises. Some people have said that if the stems are more red, they tend to leave them alone. I don't know if that's really true. You can spray the iris with a pesticide, but of course that's not available to people in Ontario anymore. So you either squish them or you cut them off, or you do what I did is I basically left them. And by the way, I tried all those remedies for a while and I just couldn't be bothered. So I just left them. And I found that certain plants eventually disappeared in the garden because they were real tasty to the boar, and others survived because they really weren't affected by the boar. The other way to deal with this is to grow other types of iris. Siberian iris aren't quite as pretty, but they're easier to grow and the plants actually look better, and they're not bothered by the iris borer. So by swapping out to a different iris, you've solved the problem. Here's a little pest that does bother me in the garden. It's the European pine sawfly. A sawfly is actually a little fly when it's an insect, and when it's a larvae, it looks like a little caterpillar. These are actually sawflies. They're not caterpillars, but as gardeners, we can call them caterpillars if you want. They love mugo pine. So I'll be going in the garden and looking at my mugo pines. They're fine. And then suddenly I'll go one day and they're just covered with these little caterpillars. And they eat all the newest needles. They just basically remove them all. So they're quite devastating to the plant. Won't kill the plant, but it looks really ugly after that. A few years ago, my mother had this concoction that she gave me. She says, "Oh, try this in the garden." You know, the home remedies from mom and grandmom. Well, it was a mixture of vinegar, sodium bicarbonate, and a little soap. Now, as a chemist, that makes no sense whatsoever, but what the heck? Let's give it a try. I sprayed them. They fell off right away, and I thought, hey, this stuff really worked. A couple of days later, I came out, and my mugo pine was all brown, and it had affected the bush and terribly. So it actually was harming the mugo pine more than it was killing the caterpillar. That's the problem with home remedies. They can be very damaging to plants. And just because you read it on the internet doesn't mean it works. So what do I do now? I decided, you know what, you can have the mugo pine. I don't care. And then they didn't show up for a few years, so the mugo pine grew back. Now I still get it once in a while, and what I do is I actually go out and I just shake the pine really hard, and they fall off. And once they're on the ground, they're not really strong enough to find the mugo pine and get back up into it. So a good shake does most of it. Here's another one I've been battling for years. This is a Viburnum beetle grub. So there is a Viburnum beetle, which I'm not sure I have ever seen. It's kind of brown and not very distinctive. And it lays its eggs on viburnums. They hatch out, and these guys are devastating. By the time they're finished, there'll be nothing left of these leaves. They'll take a whole shrub and just take all the leaves off of it. And I had one shrub and they came year after year, and I thought, oh, I'm not battling you guys. Have this shrub, I'll replace it with something else. Then suddenly one year they didn't show up. Next year they didn't show up. The year after they didn't show up. So now once in maybe every 4 years they come in and do some damage. But you know what? The bush is so strong that it just grows new leaves. So these guys show up fairly early, sort of late spring kind of thing. They eat all the leaves. And by midsummer, I have new leaves back and no viburnum beetles. The other solution is that they like certain types of viburnum. So if you buy the right kind of viburnum, you really don't have the beetle problem. Selecting the right plant solves the problem. And I'm going to use this to illustrate something in science. It's something that kind of really bothers me about people. Let's say you had a problem like this and you went out and sprayed something and then you solved the problem. Then they get on social media and you type in, oh, I sprayed with this concoction and it worked. I love the words, it worked, whatever that means. They never define what it works means. So I usually respond with something like this. I also had a problem. I had viburnum beetles on my bush, causing tremendous damage. So one year I took a lawn chair out, sat down, looked at the bush, and had a beer. You know, next year I didn't have viburnum beetles. It worked. Drinking beer solves the problem. Now, most people go, oh, well, that's kind of stupid. Like, why would you say something like that? Obviously, it wasn't drinking the beer. But the point I'm making is that if you don't run a control, you don't know something worked. So most people have one viburnum bush. They do something, and next year they don't have the problem. They assume that what they did solved it. But unless you have like 6 of these and you treat 3 of them and don't treat 3 of them, you really can't figure out whether it actually worked. That's part of the scientific method and why it's so important to listen to the science instead of people's opinion. This is a close-up of the Viburnum beetle. Ah, here's another guy. Now, this insect is actually quite cute. I mean, he's a beautiful color. His name is Lilioceras lilii. Now, you might guess he likes lilies, which he does. And it's actually a terrible pest in the garden if you're trying to grow lilies. The picture on the left there are lily beetle eggs. They're tiny little things. They're usually found on the underneath side of the leaves. They're really hard to kind of find unless you're really looking a lot. What's annoying about this is that the beetle eats your lilies, but the larvae also eat the beetle. Now this larvae is kind of unique. So on the right is a picture of the larvae, that little grub. Now what it does for defensive purposes, it coats itself with its own excrement. So now you get these brown little blobs of sticky stuff. And the way to control this is to pick all those off. Not exactly an attractive thing to do. You also want to get rid of the beetle, and you can drop either one of those into soapy water and that will kill them. The problem is that if you have lilies, these guys will show up every year, and it's something you have to do for several weeks in the garden. You have to go out every morning and collect these lily beetles. It's just a real chore. And I love lilies, and when I moved into this garden, I had quite a few of them, and for several years, no lily beetles. I thought, geez, I'm lucky. One year they hit, and for the next 5, 6 years, every year I had lily beetles. And I said, okay, forget this. I'm not picking you guys off all the time. I'm not going to grow lilies. So I got less and less lilies. The ones I had got smaller and smaller. And then suddenly the lily beetles haven't shown up again. And I haven't really seen lily beetles for the last 5 years. I have no idea why, because they are at the university, which is a couple miles from me. They had a big infestation 2 years ago, and I had none. I don't understand what it is, but doing nothing actually kind of worked. Now, there is another solution to this. Don't grow lilies. Now, some of you will look at this truck and say, hey, a whole truckload of lilies. But these are daylilies, and daylilies are not a lily. When we're talking about lilies, we're talking about true lilies that are in the family of lilies. Daylilies are completely unaffected by the lily beetle. Now, those aren't exactly interchangeable plants, but the point is, grow something that isn't affected by bugs. I have somewhere in the order of 120 different daylilies, I think. Some of them are my own crosses, and none of them really get any pests in my garden. Black spot is a big problem, particularly with roses. It makes these black spots, and around the black spots, you typically get kind of a yellow halo as the disease progresses. And some roses, they get black spot every year. And the traditional way to grow roses is you spray these guys all summer long, and that's how you control this. And I've just never been bothered to do that. You can also pick these leaves off. I don't agree with that process. Once the leaf is highly infected, you might as well pull it off. It's not doing the plant any good. But as long as half the leaf is still green, that leaf is working for the plant. It's making food for the plant. I've never noticed any difference whether I pull those leaves off or I let them drop to the ground or don't do anything at all. I still have black spot. Certain roses get black spot, and no matter what I do, they're going to have black spot because, of course, I don't spray with any chemical. There's really no home remedy for black spot. The best thing you can do is get rid of those roses, buy new ones, because a lot of the new cultivars are now resistant to black spot, and that's really the best solution. Powdery mildew is an interesting disease, and it affects a lot of plants in the garden. We call it powdery mildew, but in fact, powdery mildew is dozens, maybe hundreds of different diseases. So this is a cucumber leaf here, and they're sensitive to powdery mildew. Roses get powdery mildew, lilacs get it. But each of those species I've just mentioned are actually infected by a completely different fungus. They all look white, and we all call them powdery mildew, but almost every plant in our garden that gets powdery mildew is getting a different disease than their neighbor. So the one thing to understand is that because you have it on your lilac, it doesn't mean it's going to spread to the other plants around it. The chances are pretty low that will happen. Now, if you have a lilac and you've got a summer phlox sitting beside it and they both get mildew, you might say, oh, well, one got it from the other. No, that's not what happened. They both got a different disease. They both happen to look white. Now, there is a home remedy for powdery mildew, and there's actually two of them you can try. In both cases, you have to start spraying before you see much of the disease. So in this picture, if you look at the leaf to the far left, it's just starting to get some white spots. You better spray that at that point or even a little earlier. The leaf on the right, that's too far gone. You're not going to cure the disease with your home remedy spray. So if you want to try a spray, about 40% milk, 60% water, put in a couple drops of soap just to make it stick a little better. And that apparently prevents powdery mildew spores from germinating. So it stops the disease from starting to infect the plant. The other concoction is sodium bicarbonate, which is baking soda. Potassium bicarbonate would be a better choice. Probably get that online. It's a little harder to find. Sodium bicarbonate is our baking soda, so it's easy to find. But plants really don't like too much sodium. It's actually toxic. So the potassium would be better. Viruses are a big problem in certain plants, and they're talked about a lot, but you don't see viruses very often. In this case, we're showing a hosta that I really like called striptease on the bottom right, and that's a normal coloration, a normal plant. The one on the top left is a striptease that's been infected with the hosta virus. It shows up in different forms, but usually you get some streaking in color, and most viruses cause that. So you've got these green stripes, these kind of odd stripes. That's an indication of a virus. The other place you find viruses is on some modern tulips. So some of the tulips with what they call color breaks or streaking, little red streaking on a white tulip, that's also caused by a virus. So lesson number one is that not all plant viruses are harmful to the plant. In some cases, the plant can get the virus and grow just fine. In other cases, it's quite damaging to the plant and spreads easily. So the hosta virus is one that if you see it, dig up that plant, even include some of the soil around it and put it in the garbage. Don't compost that. You cannot kill viruses. Okay? You can't spray for them. You can't use a pesticide. The only thing you as a gardener can do is to get rid of it. And you have to do that because things like aphids will come along and take some of the juice out, and then it'll go over and sit on the good plant and inject a little juice there, and that's how the virus spreads. So it's usually spread by plant juice, either from insects or from people who are moving their dirty hands around and touching other plants, or maybe with secateurs, and you cut a virus plant and then you cut another one. I've seen the hosta virus twice in my garden, and both times it was a newly purchased plant, put it in the garden, and a couple months later, the leaves started getting really streaky. It wasn't visible on the young plant early in spring, but as the summer went along, you've seen it more and more, and I just got rid of it, and I haven't seen a virus in quite a few years. So this is one to keep an eye out for, but in general, viruses are not a problem for gardeners. This is the bronze birch borer, and I put this program together a few years ago, and I had it out today, and I'm looking at this borer, and I'm thinking, you know what? I better make sure this is the right label, the bronze birch borer. And it is, but it looks so much like the emerald ash borer, except the color's different. The ash borer is a more metallic green color, and these guys attack birches, and I have a section here about birches because that's what a lot of gardeners want to grow, and so they see these pests. By the way, birch trees is one of those trees that is lovely, but it is so insect prone, it's best to keep out of your landscape. This is another very common problem, and is the leaf miner or the birch leaf miner. And it's an insect that lays a little egg, and the egg hatches out and crawls inside. So it lives between the two layers of leaves. And then you get these brown spots as it gets a little larger. Again, you can't do anything about this. Even spraying things on the outside isn't going to work. Now, we used to have a pesticide that worked extremely well, and it was Saigon. And what you did was you just rubbed a little bit on the trunk at the bottom early in spring. It was a systemic, which was absorbed into the plant, and it killed these in the upper leaves. It worked beautifully. A bottle of that lasted me 15 years because you put so little on the plant and you're not spraying it everywhere. You're just painting a little bit on the stem. And this is one of the issues I have with this pesticide ban. Instead of making intelligent decisions about some things, they just said, we're banning everything. The birch tree is not a good choice. Here are some alternatives. The redbud has very few pests. The paper birch, and particularly the one that's called Marshall, apparently is very resistant to a lot of insects. So if you've got to have a birch, try that one. The river birch is not as nice looking in my opinion. It doesn't have that white bark. It's more of a yellowish bark, but it is a very nice tree and it tends to be insect resistant. Or go with something else like magnolias or paper bark maples. They're kind of the same size tree and would fit in the same garden design. But quite honestly, stay away from the birches.